Welcome to the Talking Transformation podcast, presented to you from the Western Cape Pod Bunker, located here in the heart of Cape Town, South Africa. This pod is presented to provide a platform and a voice for built environment professionals and interest groups who are working towards transforming the places and spaces here in South Africa. It is dedicated to those individuals and community groups that are supporting both the formal and informal processes that are shaping our cities and our spaces. Welcome to our deep dive series and the opening episode of We've Got to Talk About Housing, 26 Years and Counting, a Talking Transformation podcast episode and series. Few issues in South Africa are as emotive as housing, and the progressive rights enshrined in our constitution determine that everyone has a right to have access to adequate housing. Together with health and education, the housing programme has been a foundation of post-democratic governance and a yardstick against which South Africa has been measured both internally and within the global housing market. The conversation that follows today and the conversations that will come in the coming weeks sets the context for a series of deep dive conversations with human settlements practitioners and activists. We look back at the achievements and the shortcomings of 26 years worth of implementation, 2 generations if you like, since 1994. We consider the current challenges and look ahead to the future of human settlements in South Africa. We ask about the vision and the aspirations of the Mandela administration under the original leadership of Minister Joe Slovo, the first housing minister post-democracy. The tenets of the Reconstruction Development Programme, or the RDP, and the Housing White Paper of 1994. We consider the relevance of those aspirations in 2020 and how does that hold for the coming decade. The terminology, the typology, the availability of resources, specifically the land and the funding, the policy instruments and the institutional capacity, the suitability of solutions, all of these we're hoping to cover in the coming weeks. What is the deal? And how is that deal understood? How has it changed? And what indeed needs to change? In this first episode, we kick off our deep dive talking with Monty. Monty has served at the forefront of the housing programme and delivery since 1994, and in fact, as you'll hear, his involvement in the human settlement or housing space started even before 1994. His CV is certainly a testimonial to public service and contribution to the housing field and the built environment more generally. He served at the executive level of Gauteng provincial government, working with the housing department there. He was the founding chief executive officer of the South African Cities Network. He's also served as the deputy director general at the National Department of Human Settlements. Since 2008, he's been governance advisor to that same department at National. He's eminently placed to assist us in understanding the context, the achievements, and reflecting on some of the shortcomings in that housing and human settlement space. I joined Monty whilst he was in Cape Town leading a capacity building team from the National Department, specifically looking at the National Upgrading of Informal Settlements Support Programme. As always, we hope you enjoy the episode and we welcome feedback through our Twitter platform on Talking Transfo and the number 1. Over to Monty. So it's a Tuesday afternoon and I'm sat here up in Woodstock with Monty. Monty has travelled down from Johannesburg, basically leading one of the delegations dealing with the Informal Settlements Upgrading Programme. Monty, welcome to Cape Town. Good to see you.
Thank you.
Today is about trying to get a sense of the history of the housing programme, the housing policy, the framing of where we have come from as a country. We're now in 2020, we're 26 years on from democracy. You've been at the forefront of a lot of the policy thinking in the housing sector since 1994. Our paths crossed in about 2000 when you were working at the Gauteng Housing Department. I joined you there for a short period.
Yeah.
But you've been around. You've been in the national space, you've been in the provincial space, and here we are talking now about a particular program within the National Housing Programme. My intention today is to try and help our listeners, some of those who won't remember 1994. Maybe they weren't even born then. Let's kick off. I mean, how do you remember those first years, those post-democracy years and your activism leading up to 1994?
Well, I think there's 2 issues, Peter. I think the one is that I'd grown up in the inner city of Johannesburg and then we were moved in terms of the Group Areas Act. Because of that move, was always interested in issues not only of housing, but urban development issues, which included the fact that my mother and father would leave when it was dark in winter and come home when it was dark. So there's always been that interest in housing. From an activist point of view, a lot of the issues around community mobilization within the anti-apartheid struggle revolved around housing. What housing there was in the townships, the overcrowding, etc., etc. So there was an enduring interest in housing. What was also quite important as we started looking at other issues, the technical side became important. And so I joined an NGO called COPE. And COPE was part of what was called the Urban Sector Network. And it was a bunch of NGOs that provided technical support to communities. So that was the starting point. The issue of developing a policy for the new South Africa actually started around about 1992. It was in the National Housing Forum, and SANCO, the South African National Civics Organization, asked me to represent them at the National Housing Forum. It was a very interesting experiment, parallel to the national constitutional negotiations. Because what you had there was you had the private sector there, you had political parties there, you had NGOs there, you had community organizations there. All of them were sitting in this one room attempting to craft a policy, and a very, very difficult process. But in a way, it was a university for all of us about what the big issues were, about suddenly preparing to govern.
What are the diverse characters, personalities, backgrounds of the people that's in that room?
The people that really were quite crucial to it were the people from Kagiso Trust, including people like Eric Malobi. Then there was the Urban Foundation people, which had Matthew Nell in it, and then you had Ishmael Nkabela, who was part of managing a very, very difficult process. The banks were very interesting. They came to the party on the back of a boycott of bonds. So mortgage bonds, there was a bond boycott. Then the ANC was there. Billy Cobbett, who became the first DG of housing. Then there was Juma Nkosi, who was the Kasatu rep, who became the mayor of Ekurhuleni. Then there was a bunch of NGOs. There were quite a lot of important people that were sitting in the room that became the leading thinkers around housing policy at both then and post.
Post 1994.
Yeah. What's very interesting, the first white paper, the first policy paper, was the Reconstruction and Development paper that was published in 94. The second one was the housing white paper, and it was a result of the work of 2-3 years of work within the National Housing Forum.
I mean, those certainly seem like the foundation documents when we talk about the RDP, the Reconstruction Development Programme, that white paper. Certainly set the scene and the tone for years to come. And that first administration of Nelson Mandela and through Joe Slovo as the minister. Very exciting time. What was your first role in that democratic space, within an officialdom space?
You've got to look at it slightly beforehand, because eventually what happens is Billy Cobbett, who was quite crucial to this, reported directly to Joe Slovo. And it was a real hard issue, because very much in the ANC position would be the Freedom Charter and saying there shall be housing.
Understood.
But what did that mean? And there was one very crucial issue, and it's a point I've made time and time again. What the ANC inherited as a country was a country that was bankrupt. I always make the point that if the ANC was a company and they did due diligence,
would they have taken
over the country? Okay, so you were faced with severe constraints.
Understood. Yeah.
And so you had to now craft a policy that took into account the fiscal and financial realities on the one hand, but you also had to take into account the expectations
Completely.
of people, being denied ownership, being temporary sojourners in the cities. How did you start looking at those issues? Having access to mortgage bonds was always a huge problem. So it was those various elements that one had to look at, which became the pillars of what eventually became the housing policy, which still stands today.
It's interesting reading. I went and pulled out from my own library the RDP document. I think I picked it up from a car boot sale for a couple of rands. But reading it, rereading it, and reminding myself, Chapter 2, meeting basic needs. Some of the critical success factors that were in that document back in 1994 talked about a coherent housing policy, a mass housing program, a single national housing department, a goal of not less than 5% of the national budget being dedicated for the next 5 years. Now, I mean, there are more, but these were some of the underpinning messages. And how do you think in those first 5 years, some of those elements came into being sort of the foundations that we still are working with today? And what do you think has had to change over that period of time?
Well, I think the first thing one had to look at is that we had severe fiscal issues. But the target was 5% of the national budget. That target was never ever reached, not in the last 26 years. The second thing was that, almost everybody and their poodle had a housing department. Even Foreign Affairs had a housing budget because it provided money to the so-called independent homelands. Okay? So you had a huge fragmentation. What the housing white paper did was to deal with that fractured housing sector from a government point of view. We needed one housing department. We needed to start clarifying roles, functions, etc., as regards provincial government and local government. That was the one issue. The next issue was, how do we deal with the financing of housing outside of the fiscus? What would be the role of the banks? What do we need? What were the risks there? What did we need to put in place to get the banks to lend, but also to mitigate their risk? What was the nature of the housing subsidy? And I think there are a couple of issues in relation to that. The one issue in relation to that was, what was the nature of the subsidy? Basically, it was said that if we are going to have a sustainable way of dealing with our budget crisis, what we need to do is to have some certainty on how we budget for the subsidy. So we went off for a once-off capital grant, because you could budget on a yearly basis and you would be able to be clear about what that budget would be, and you could eventually, it became a 3-year allocation, but it is a once-off capital subsidy.
Understood.
Clear, transparent, targeted. The issue was the size of the subsidy. That's when you have a real issue, because the original functions was to centralize the housing function at national, but you then had increasing pressure from both the National Party and the Inkatha Freedom Party for provinces to have additional functions. So they made it a concurrent function, which meant that a lot of the community-based organizations, their politicians became the housing MECs. And they were saying, you guys are now punting a 12,500 Rand subsidy. The MECs were saying, you can't punt a housing subsidy that's hardly going to provide you with nothing more than a starter house. And are you saying you're going to give us less than what the apartheid government gave our people? So we want 17,500. And it became a huge issue. Joe Slovo versus his own MECs in the ANC,
That's a big challenge.
battling in public. I mean, the press used to follow around these min-max. Eventually, we then had to broker a deal. And the deal was very simple. You know, policy and sausage making might be what people like. But the real problem that we have is don't watch how it got made. So what they did was they took the two amounts, split it down the middle, and that's how we ended up with our first subsidy of 15,000 Rand.
So there you go, the first lesson in housing: compromise, compromise, compromise. So 15,000 was the first amount. Today, just to bring it up to 2020 figures, it's about 150,000.
In effect, it's 250,000, because if you take into account the other contributions, which is bulk infrastructure, etc., etc. So what happens is, what was originally supposed to be a progressive realization, as the Constitution says, of housing over a period of time, became a demand, not only from provincial politicians, but national politicians, that we must give people houses. Which means that one of the key issues around the policy was, do you go wide and give more people subsidies? Or do you give narrow and give people more quality? So it's a quality versus quantity issue. And more, as time has moved on, we have then moved into a situation where the subsidy became bigger and bigger, the quality of houses became better, and then the demand and the expectation is, I will get a house, which has a consequence, and that consequence is that backlogs start growing bigger.
Your reach into that backlog and to deal with the constant annual growth,
And then you're not having an increase in the amount allocated for housing, which then became known as human settlements. But I think it's quite important to remember that was the basis of the first housing policies. And Slovo had the backing of Nelson Mandela, and that was about political trust. And so it carried, I mean, what is seen by many to have been a reasonably conservative policy. Why not interest rate subsidies, etc., etc.? It was about to manage a really, really bad fiscal situation and to have some certainty around budgets.
In researching for this discussion, Monty, I went and had a look at the National Department of Human Settlements 2018-19 annual report. What was really interesting there is that it proudly and correctly sort of boasts of providing 4.7 million housing opportunities, which I know of no other country which has come close in terms of those numbers, certainly not in terms of that time frame. And I know China builds at a particular rate, but in terms of state-sponsored, that is a laudable effort. When we go back to the RDP document, looking at what the few numbers that were in there, it talked about an estimated urban housing backlog of 1.3 million households. Hostels and rural areas, another plus minus 3 million. So in total about, let's call it 4.3 million as a backlog, starting point for 1994, opening the ledger, if you like. It also said that we'd see about 200,000 units per annum, or household formations per annum. So basically giving you an additional 5.2 million households over that, what we now at 26 years. So my proposition in coming into this was to say, it seems like we were excellent at getting the backlog, dealing with the backlog of just say 4.3 million estimated in 1994, 4.7 million housing opportunities realized. Is it fair to say that we were able to meet that initial target, recognizing it stretched over that 26-year period, but that we really have never really come to grips with the urban growth year on year, the household growth, particularly in our towns and cities across the country?
Well, there's two issues that really seized the housing sector then and the governing party, which was the ANC. The first was the issue of the backlog. Now, if you look at the RTP document, and it has many very laudable principles, etc. If you look at it, it was basically about numbers, 1 million houses, 2 million water connections, 4 million, and I'm not giving you exact numbers, electricity connections, etc., etc. So it set a target because of those backlogs. The real big issue was we had these huge backlogs. Okay, so that was the one issue. The second issue, which was very important, you must remember that the once-off capital grant was aimed at ownership. And so we drove a home ownership program as the central point because black people were denied
that right.
Yeah. So to pursue the numbers, we had to find land. You must remember the first couple of years, which we totally underestimated, we hardly spent our housing budget.
Interesting to reflect that now.
We hardly spent our housing budget because we didn't realize how long it would take. What was the only land available? It was land on the outskirts of the townships. So we drove the numbers. I mean, there's huge criticism about the apartheid spatial problems that we have. And I think it's a fair criticism. But if you take into account the context about we've got to get those numbers, and eventually we got to get to the million mark. I think we missed it by a year. Okay.
Still have an achievement.
Yeah, okay. I mean, it's a hell of an achievement. But where we put it, the second issue, it was a totally supply side subsidy. So we were expecting very little from people in terms of investment. We're saying the state will give. And it's a thing that still happens today. And very often they're saying, no, people are just too dependent. It's not people. You developed machinery to deliver housing. You then get people getting into queues. And there's a certain behavior that begins to emerge from it. But if you look at, and you were talking about upgrading of informal settlements earlier on, I mean, the amount of housing stock that's been provided by people themselves, I think gives lie to this dependency theory that people are just totally dependent on the state. But the problem is we still look at the South African housing sector in terms of what has the state provided. The other part of it is something that there's been a lot of interesting research about. But I think the point of what we're saying is went for an ownership program, we went for going for targets. The consequences of that was, one, people were moving further and further out as we developed on the peripheries. Two, your home ownership didn't allow for enough mobility. The kind of, what is the greater demand? I mean, I don't know. I don't know if you've given thought to that. But rental is a very, very important issue,
It's massive.
Because if you link it to the economy, mobility becomes a very important thing. That's one of the consequences.
Monty, do you think we missed a trick in that first sort of 10 years post-democracy around the securing, dedicating enough funding for the securing of land, particularly in inner city locations? Particularly where those land prices were typically going to be higher just given the property dynamics? Or do you think we did enough in those first 10 years? And do you think we might be suffering with the consequences now, 24 years, 26 years later?
You must remember the house building, the RDP was one model. The other model was the social housing model that was about higher densities and about rental. And then there were a number of actors that were looking at inner city regeneration. And I think one of the issues is that we did not pay enough attention, not only to well-located land, but also to rental and inner city housing. The problems that emerged, and I must admit, I was a great fan of social housing, but the problems that emerged with social housing was we didn't take into account the real costs of social housing.
And those long-term costs, the operational costs, etc., the management costs.
Well, not even talking about that. Then there were the management costs, then there were the rates, and then we started over-regulating it. We then started setting up very complex institutional arrangements around that. But I think and we could have simplified that. I think the other issue which is quite important is that the ability to expropriate has always been there with local government. We're not even talking of the Constitution, which also allows you to expropriate. The non-willingness, the political will to expropriate was very difficult. The banks were very influential. I mean, the issue of redlining was very real. So properties declined, there was investment went out of the window. I mean, we tried desperately to deal with both the risks that banks were facing by introducing the mortgage indemnity insurance schemes, etc., etc. But it didn't change the tide. The other issue that was quite important, and I'm not saying that I saw it at the time, I only saw it subsequently. The other issue that was quite important was we didn't understand the weakening of local government. The weakening, particularly in the metros, of a whole bunch of things, and the rebuilding of them. The weakening is a result of, at one stage, for, say, Johannesburg, you might have had 6 different municipalities.
Sub-councils and so forth, yeah.
Yeah. Bringing them all together, beginning to fund them. Your constituency was much wider. And to get that right took years. So the issue of having a political will against the threat of disinvestment was quite important. We could have addressed it earlier. We could have understood issues around where's your rates based? How do you deal with the poor in relation to gentrification? What's your balances around that? We started looking at other models, whether it's Brazilian model or whatever. Point was we simply didn't have the capacity, the state capacity to deal with some of those issues.
So whilst we're talking about capacity, today we went into a very interesting sort of historical perspective on informal settlements. I think the numbers, if I recall correctly, please remind me if I'm wrong, but in 1994 we sort of started with, again, opening the ledger, 300 informal settlements countrywide. That figure by 2017 hits to, I think it was 2,200.
Yeah.
Exponential growth over that period. And an estimated sort of 8% of our population within the country, of the 57 million or so of our people, living within those conditions. So the whole question of capacity, at one stage, the national government was very clear in terms of the idea of eradicating informal settlement. It was a very evocative word, eradicate, obliterate, remove from the landscape this idea of informal settlement. And my sense is that somewhere along the line that message has changed quite fundamentally to eradicate, to the upgrading, to recognizing that these are permanent features on our landscape. I think it talks to that capacity, that realization that we're not going to be able to build our way out with one unit, one house, one title deed, one service site. It's probably going to be a service site and a title as our deal going forward. That's a proposition I'm putting to you. But at the same time, I'm saying that change in the wording, eradicate to upgrade, how important do you think that is, or am I confusing the issue?
No, I think the issue of upgrading was probably always on the agenda. But as a former MEC and who used to be my boss said, remember, a politician always walks around with a scissor in his inner pocket to cut a ribbon. And I will say to you, up until today, while we have made the policy transition from eradication to upgrade, there is still, I think, political resistance to upgrade of informal settlements, up until today. There's also resistance from a lot of the bureaucracy. I think it might be better in the metros, But we've been running workshops right across the board. And still the issue that some people raise, and I think it was about 3 months ago when we did this workshop in the Northwest, where a guy was still arguing, an official was still arguing, and supported by some of his colleagues, of how do we stop people coming into urban areas. The only example I could give was, I said, I visited China a while ago, and I asked them the question about people coming into cities. And they said, we have a floating population, and we'll take stronger administrative measures. Because there are whole parts of Beijing where there's shack farming happening. So I said, okay, so you want to compare the two about urbanization and trying to stop urbanization? China's got the Red Army, we've got the Red Ants.
So different scales.
So the urbanization phenomenon is still a major issue, where people are still saying, how do we keep people away from the cities? Now, throughout history, economic development, the way economies work, how cities grow, all of that, we still think that we might be able to do it administratively, keep people out of the urban areas. Or why don't we make a major investment in rural areas, grow their economy, etc., etc. However expensive at least, and not understanding that cities are engines of growth. That was the other part of my history. I was the CEO of South African Cities Network, and we started looking at these numbers. We started looking at the economies. We started looking at the densities. Cities were very important. We also recognize that there is now major pressures on secondary cities as the bigger cities begin to, their ability to absorb becomes, they're less able to absorb. And this is not only a South African phenomenon. If you start looking at urbanization patterns in Brazil, for instance, São Paulo and Rio are actually not growing as fast as some of the secondary cities there.
You were saying today you've spent quite a bit of your time traveling around the country, particularly some of those secondary towns and the mining towns. What are some of the things that you're seeing there, Monty? What's driving that growth? Is it the mining economy? If so, what happens when that mining comes to an end? And what are some of the drivers? What are some of the themes from your extensive traveling around the country?
Look, let's go back to the policy prescripts. While there were many things that we got slightly wrong, the kind of 6 major issues around the urban management, the urban structure issues, still an issue. Issues of providing subsidization, the issues related to finance and financing it. All those things are still there. They've been tweaked in different ways. What we're finding a lot more is, first of all, the growth of informal settlements in some of the major mining towns in municipalities that have got very little capacity. Some of them are under administration, like Madibeng. The second big issue around that, and is something that we haven't come to terms with as well, in terms of the issue of informal settlements, urbanization, and a different dynamic there, is a lot of that urbanization, for want of a better word, in mining towns are on traditionally managed land. So you have some of the informal settlements that are even denser than you'll find in urban areas.
Fascinating.
Umhlatuzi, which is Richards Bay, Marikana,
Northwest.
There was a statistic up to date that one of the fastest growing places was Kamahara.
Yeah.
The major town there is Katu. That's where some of your major iron ore, manganese mines are around, and there's the growing of informal settlements. The same prescripts that we then introduced in 2003 with Breaking New Ground applies there. The same, for want of a better word, solution applies there. The complicating factor is that it's on traditional land. And the second issue is a lot of mine workers have now gone to live in the communities, and they earn more than the subsidy prescription is, so they don't qualify for subsidy. So there's another set of issues. What I'm saying in overall terms around that evolution of policy from 1994, as we go through the years, is a combination of, I think, a good set of policy prescripts, but I think where we have major issues is that coherence that the RDP talked about was lost in translation. As more and more new people came in, as bureaucracies grew, people didn't understand what were the underpinnings. And so you've got a lot of dysfunctionality and a lot of inconsistency. And one of your particular problems around that is intergovernmental relations and the dysfunctionalities around that, no matter which party is in power. Then you add with mining towns into the mixed traditional authorities. And it's a very difficult sector to work in.
Absolutely.
You know, my problem is when someone said, oh, you've been so many years in the housing sector. Well, how do you want to be remembered? I said, on my gravestone, simply, he tried and he failed.
We're looking ahead now. What do you see in the future? Inclusionary housing, upscale rental, greater backyarding phenomena. What are the things that you think we should be thinking about? The listeners now who are listening to this saying, well, that's all good, it's in the past. I'm dealing with this today. What do you think some of those issues that we should be thinking about, developing policy, convincing decision makers to take particular approaches, and supported with activist groups and lobbying groups? What do you think some of those issues are?
Well, this is about myself rather than...
You're allowed to be personal.
Yeah. My head makes me a pessimist. My heart makes me an optimist, because whenever I'm dealing, whether it's with community organizations or more recently a lot with trade unions in the mining towns, I have a real sense, despite the noise, the public noise, of people doing stuff. There is a real sense of, we'll do it for ourselves. I remember being in some place close to George where a guy from the Communist Party, but from the local branch of the Communist Party, when we were talking of informal settlements, and some people said we want houses, and this guy said, no, we know because we gave the numbers of how long it's going to take. He said, but in the meanwhile, we want to live in dignity. So why don't you give us some support around that? So there is that attitude. So I'm saying, don't start evicting us and that kind of thing. That's the one point, that we must recognize people's agency. And I think that's very, very, very important. To do that is we then have to embrace something else which is very difficult, and that is to embrace informality. Not that we romanticize informality, but to embrace it to the extent that we're saying there are housing markets there are land markets there. How do we help people maximize that? Do you know that it takes, I don't know, a day or a day and a half to find rental accommodation in Diepsloot, whereas it'll take you a month or 2 months to find it in Hillbrow?
We're hearing of 20-minute turnaround times in the noon at the moment here in Cape Town.
There's
a speed.
So there's something happening there, and let's help it happen. So, but I'm first of all arguing for the agency of people. It doesn't take away from government the responsibility for an urban management issue. We've been big on infrastructure, but we're not great on management. Because poor people want urban management as much as anybody else.
Understood.
On the west side of Joburg, one of the big issues people had in informal settlement was, we don't want a tavern next to us. And they said, so I'm saying that's recognizing that there's a management issue, there's people's agency. Government needs to build its capacity, its organization, to manage and to provide a greater responsiveness. And I know it's not easy. And so I'm not asking for you're going to turn planners and engineers and those people into social activists, but you can provide the kind of multidisciplinary teams that when you're upgrading stuff, or when you're dealing with backyarding, or even when you're dealing with inner city properties, that we have the management capacity and the capacity to respond to those issues.
And that may imply a series of revised or reconsidered, differentiated standards, right, around how we're going to go about, as you say, the urban management of some of our areas. If we're going to hold it to a first world standard of building and so forth, that's going to be very different from what we are seeing happening quite organically in some of our towns and cities, where people are developing multi-story developments without building plans and are housing many people off the books, if you like.
Some of the basics would be first world. But what you need to do is to understand the social dynamics that's happening, the economic dynamics, and saying, let's provide those kinds of spaces. If you look at some of the Asian nations, they're 24-hour-a-day cities. On last week Saturday, not this past Saturday, previous Saturday, Sunday afternoon went through the middle of Joburg, and it was buzzing. Vibrant, it didn't look very clean, so we need to clean. We need first world standards around refuse removal, cleanliness, that kind of thing, the management side. That when we come to standards, it's not so much that it's first world standards. It's more that we still hung up with colonial standards, colonial town planning standards. I mean, and also maybe a particular kind of colonial stuff. I mean, what does Rome and Venice and those places look like? Huh? I mean, they're not straight streets and grids. Let's be adaptable, and I'm not asking for government not to govern. Government must govern.
You're not saying abdicate your responsibility, no. But you're saying be more facilitator.
So you're saying that there's a governance side responding to you, but we've also got rules. And that's the minimum. We continue to have a reasonable housing subsidy policy. We continue to have a reasonable understanding of what's happening. I mean, we're not a Luanda, we're not a Mumbai yet, but we need to up our game in terms, I think it's the urban management, governance and governability side that becomes most important.
Thanks for that personal reflection. I really appreciate that, Monty. And before we wrap, two final questions, somewhat linked. Looking back on those early conversations, 1992, and now sitting here 2020, all those years later, what's been your high point in that housing journey? And in contrast to that, what was something that you think back and go, possibly could have done better?
I think the high point was that, for want of a better word, the Mandela period. And it's not because of Mandela. It was the people that went into government, had a mission, felt they could change and make a difference. And they were almost more like missionaries in the bureaucracy. And that changed very fundamentally. And I think when it started changing and you got into the bureaucracy yourself, and when you suddenly realize I'm losing my skills, and maybe I'm losing my empathy for people, that I decided I'm out of here. And so I still continue to work, and I still love the work I do. And I look fondly upon my time in government, and few generations have a chance to change it so fundamentally. But I think that when I look at engagements with a variety of people that are within organizations and not only within government, I just worry that the heart is gone and the passion for changing people's lives and getting joy from it is something that I sometimes worry about.
Well, we're going to have to find it. We're going to have to find that passion. We're going to have to find that joy if we're going to continue going forward. Monty, I can't thank you enough. Thank you for your time, for taking this opportunity to reflect. It means a great deal to me personally. I really hope our listeners will get the benefit of listening to what you've had to say, taking us back into that amazing period, post-pre and post-1994. Thank you for also helping those of us like myself who had the pleasure of working in and around you. Good luck for the future. Good luck on your constant tour of the National Upgrading Informal Settlements Programme around the country. And we look forward to finding out how you're doing in maybe a year's time. Let's check back in, find out how you're keeping and where your thinking's at. All the very best.
Thanks, Peter, and best of luck.
Thank you, sir. Enjoy the rest of your time in Cape Town.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Talking Transformation podcast. Please engage with us and let us know your thoughts on this episode. You can do so via the Anchor podcast platform. There's a voice message function available via the app. You can also follow us on Twitter via Talking Transfo and the number 1. So Talking Transfo 1. Our theme music is kindly made available by Tribal Need. Find out about the music, the street art shows here in Cape Town and Europe via tribalneed.com.